already established earlier in this conversation that there are trillions upon trillions of viral variants. And a very, very tiny fraction of those pose a human risk, almost an infinitesimally small fraction. And so the vast majority of viruses are harmless. And then the theory would be, well, there are some that are still harmful, and we need to understand those, and fair enough. And one of the ways of understanding them is to produce more dangerous viral variants in the lab, and then we can study these more dangerous variants. But that seems to me to assume that you're presuming that the more dangerous functions that you're adding to the viruses are in some sense going to be representative of more dangerous viruses in general, so that you can generalize beyond them. And you're also assuming that the risk of an accident or an outbreak in relationship to poor handling of these new viruses that you're creating is less of a risk than natural variation in the viruses themselves would be likely to produce. It isn't obvious to me at all, a priori, that any of those presumptions are even vaguely correct.
That's exactly right. That's exactly the calculation that they were making. That it was worth doing this research because you would identify viruses that could cause a pandemic this way, and that risk, the risk of causing an accident, was less than that risk that we're running naturally. There was a lot of criticism of this when they began this sort of research, not just in Wuhan but elsewhere in the world. About 10 years ago, under a US-funded program called PREVENT, there was a number of virologists who quite openly said, we think this is a mistake. We think you're looking for a needle in the haystack. You'll probably find the wrong needle. We don't think that you're going to find anything useful this way. And they didn't also add, but there was other people saying, and by the way, aren't you creating the very risk that you're worrying about? You're looking for a gas leak with a lighted match, as someone put it. Now, I think most of us now looking at what was going on in Wuhan, in that laboratory, in the years leading up to the pandemic, are convinced that even if this one didn't happen that way, it could have, and that going forward we should not be doing this kind of research. Well, after a short pause, the US government resumed its donations to the EcoHealth Alliance to work with partner labs doing this kind of research elsewhere in the world during and after the pandemic.
Okay, so let's take that apart for a minute. So that's predicated on the assumption that the Republicans and the conservatives, let's say, both narrowly and more broadly, have something specific to gain, right, in a power-related manner, by advancing the claim that the origin of the virus was, in some sense, a lab leak. And for the life of me, I can't understand why that's political. It's like, it was either a lab leak or it wasn't. That's pretty damn evident. And it isn't obvious to me that the facts stand on one side of the political divide or another. So then I'm wondering, why in the world is it that Science Magazine is publishing an article claiming that the real reason that anybody's concerned about whether or not this was a lab leak is because of Republican Party shenanigans? And so what do you think about that?
Well, it's true that America is very politically polarized, and there's a tendency in much of the media to see everything in a Republican versus Democrat lens these days. That doesn't work for the rest of us who aren't Americans. We don't have to see the world that way. We can think of it as a scientific question rather than a political question. It's true that early in the pandemic, a Republican president, Donald Trump, kept saying it might have come from a lab. Well, we happen to know that a number of scientists privately agreed with him but didn't say so at the time. But the real divide here, and we see this on social media all the time, we get active debates about this going on. The real divide is not between people who think it was a lab leak and people who think it was a market zoonosis, but people who think that we haven't answered the question yet and we need to keep looking at both hypotheses, what I call the open question side of the debate, which I'm on, which my co-author's on, which everybody who thinks a lab leak is possible thinks. I don't know anyone who thinks it's 100% certain it was a lab leak. And on the other side of the question are the case closed crowd who say, no, we can already rule out a lab leak for certain. And that seems to me immensely premature. And here's why. In the case of SARS, we were able to rule out a lab leak and know that it came over a market because we found the infected animal. We found the civet cat that had caught the virus from the bat and gave it to people. And we found the index cases. These were food handlers and chefs and people who were cooking civet cats. The chain of transmission was very clear. In this case, we've found no infected animals. We found no evidence in blood banks of previously infected people. We found nobody who looks like an index case. The only thing we found is that there was a concentration of early cases in that food market in Wuhan. And a number of scientists, the ones referred to in that John Cohen article in Science, regard that evidence that there were quite a lot of early cases in that market or near that market as so-called dispositive. In other words, we can close the case. We can go home, shut up the inquiry and say we know for certain it came out of that. And the rest of us say, no, hang on, you haven't found an infected animal, you haven't found an early case. And by the way, we know why there was a concentration of cases in that market, because in the early days of the pandemic, if you had pneumonia and you went to hospital, they were told to consider COVID as a cause only if you lived near that market. So it's a circular argument.